Psalm 126 is a psalm many of us know by heart. This is not true for most of the Psalms for me, but I know Psalm 126 because it is sung every Shabbat, both Friday night, afternoon, as we get ready to do Birkat Hamazon, the grace after meals. I'll just pause as people are popping on. I want to welcome Brad Crenshaw. I know you're a friend of Julia's, and it's a treat, and I want to welcome you to our study this morning. So, our goal in the study of a psalm like Psalm 126 is to look at it closely to get a sense of its literary artistry, its composition, which, as is the nature of poetry, often points to ambiguity, which is particularly true of Psalm 126. So it is, as I said, among the best known of Psalms because it's sung repeatedly in traditional context. And at the same time, when you look at it as we will now, you'll kind of, I hope, you'll smile with me to appreciate that so much of the artistry is knowing, is this psalm referring to an event that's now being celebrated? Because the theme of the psalm, the word that gets repeated 3 times and is the inclusio at the beginning and at the end, is the word rina, which means joyous song. This is a joyous song of national redemption. But what is unclear by the grammar, by the tenses in the Hebrew, is this psalm in celebration of what has occurred, or is it a prayer for what will occur? When it says, we hayinu kecholmim, is it we are as dreamers? Is it we will be like dreamers? Or is it we were like dreamers? And what does this image of dreaming suggest? So without further context, let me first put up the psalm. It's only 6 verses. We will share it together. And then, as is our way, I'll go back to point out the artistry of the psalm and the variety of translations equaling interpretations of what the psalm is referring to. I chose one of the famous lines as the title, which comes toward the end. Verse 5, they who sowed with a tear, with joyous song, shall reap. You can see I'm constantly tweaking to acknowledge how translators will often translate for what sounds right, like the plural of tears, but in the Hebrew, it's more specific. In this case, it's in the singular. A song of ascents, which is Psalms 120 to 134. When Adonai restores the fortunes of Zion, we are like dreamers. Then we will fill with laughter our mouth and our tongue with joyous song. Then they will say among the nations, greatly has Adonai done with these. Greatly Adonai does with us. We delight. Restore Adonai our fortune like wadis in the Negev. They who sowed with a tear, with joyous song shall reap. He goes and weeps, carrying a basket of seed. He comes, he shall come with joyous song, carrying his sheaves. All right, so from the beginning, there is ambiguity. The king James Version, for instance, which is also true for some of the classic Jewish commentators, will translate in verse 1 this phrase, Shivat Zion, as the captivity of Zion. And to be a Shevi is a captive, but the word Shivat is used elsewhere, like in the book of Job 42:10, to refer to specifically restoring one's fortunes. So, for instance, relating to the story of Job, at the very end of that description of the man who lost so much and suffered, it will say that God restored Shivat, his fortunes, and gave him twice. Vadonai shav et shvut Iyov, and God returned the fortune of Job, 42:10, v'yasaf et kol asher Iyov lemishneh, and gathered to him for Job twofold. And so, classically, because of context, Shivat Zion is often translated as the captives of Zion. More contemporary translations tend to translate it as the fortunes of Zion. And here's another interesting play. In Psalm 125, Zion referred to a city, to Jerusalem. Here, it can either refer to, restores the fortunes of Zion, could mean restore Jerusalem to feeling its wholeness. As we saw, Jerusalem is often given those anthropomorphic qualities, or it can refer to the people of Israel. Both are possible. And again, the difference between poetry and prose is that the art of poetry is double entendre, the possibility of more than one reading. Many of the translations translate this opening verse in the past tense. Namely, when Adonai restored the fortunes of Zion, we were like dreamers. And those possibilities are that this refers to the return of the exile from Babylonia. And this was written either, and these are two different possibilities, after Cyrus the Great, the Persian conqueror who gave the Jews permission to return to Zion, or it could be written a little bit later with the prophet Ezra and Nehemiah returning with more, or it can be prophetic. Some classic translators or commentators would say it was written by King David. They like to attribute the Psalms to King David in a classical sense, as he is writing this prophetically anticipating the exile of his children, or it is written in exile in Babylonia as a dream yet to be fulfilled. So others will translate it in the future. When Adonai will restore the fortunes of Zion, we will be like dreamers. All are possible in the Hebrew. Now, this phrase, I'm into dreaming, and I'll show my hand in somewhat, but we are like dreamers or will be like dreamers. So the last word of verse 1, to some degree, more than coincidentally, links with the last word of the psalm. For the last word of the psalm is sheaves, right? With joyous song carrying a sheaves. Well, to a biblical ear, this word alumotav, sheaves, echoes the story of Joseph. For Joseph, Genesis 37:7 says to his brothers, V'hinei anachnu me'almim alumim. And behold, as he describes his dream, we were binding sheaves, betoch hasadeh, in the midst of the field. So just like Joseph's dream of sheaves of the field was indeed actualized as his brothers stand before him later in Egypt, bowing to him. So, back to our opening verse, we were like dreamers, can suggest that what we dream can and will become reality. Though I'll pause again with the word dreamers. It can mean many different things to be a dreamer. So that you can have Ibn Ezra. I often see Irene and smile, who says it's like a dream in terms of it's going to be beyond, like pinch yourself, amazing. When we say it was like a dream, meaning it was like so amazing. So we are so amazed by our fortunes being returned. Sforno will say, because it was as if it was impossible to be realized. It was only a dream, but yet it is being realized. Some would say, well, dreaming refers to fleeting. We are like dreamers. All of this is fleeting. What is fleeting? It can be the past. So it can be understood that looking back, this is referring not to the celebration, not to the arrival back in Israel, but it's the dream looking back, which is Rabbi David Kimchi, for instance, who says, what we went through in exile is like a dream, meaning it's not real. This is real. The returning to Israel. We have as if awakened from a bad dream, knowing that the pains of exile behind us are easily forgotten like a dream. We're fleeting like a dream. And so even this image, we are like dreamers, can either refer to the past, it can refer to the celebration of the moment. It can be both, of course, simultaneously. Then we will fill with laughter our mouth and our tongue with joyous song. Then they will say among the nations, greatly has Adonai done with these. And I pause to appreciate how what the nations say matters throughout Psalms and throughout Torah. You may recall that at the Song of the Sea, Exodus 15, verses 14 to 16 are a description of how the nations will respond to Israel's delivery. Shimu amim chil achaz yosh, shimu amim yirgazun. When the nations hear of what happened, they will tremble. Chil achaz yoshvei palashet. The people of Philistine will be grabbed by agony. And so the greatness of God, who is the creator, his signs, his wonders, here in verse 2, matter not only to Israel, but what God does matters to creation, to all the peoples. One little piece of Talmud that relates to lines 1 and 2. And 1 and 3 is as if a unit, and then 4 and 6 is a unit. We all know that you break a glass at a wedding. At the end of the wedding, and the explanation that's classically given is we live in a broken world, and therefore in this moment of greatest joy, recall that there is a destroyed temple or that the world is in need of repair. That has its root in the Talmud and Brachot 30b to 31a, and there's a couple of rabbis. The first is Mar, the son of Ravina, who was making a feast for his son's wedding. And he saw that his colleagues, the sages, were enjoying themselves excessively. So he brought a valuable cup. It was worth 400 zuz, an enormous amount of money. And he broke it before them so that they would become sad. That's in the aftermath of the destruction of the temple, with the sense that you should never forget the sadness that we also have as our shadow. And then the story parallel is told of another rabbi of about the same time, Rav Ashi. But here's the end of that little discussion because it's a description of verse 2. Rabbi Yochanan, he's of the first century of Israel, and he has this study partner, his brother-in-law, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. In this case, interestingly, Rabbi Yochanan quotes his brother-in-law and says, "One is forbidden to fill his mouth with mirth in this world as long as we are in exile, as it is stated in verse 1 of this psalm. Only then will our mouths fill with laughter and our lips with song." The Talmud asks, when will that joyous era arrive? And now using verse 2, when they will say among the nations, the Lord has done great things with these. They said about Reish Lakish that throughout his life, he did not fill his mouth with laughter in this world. Once he heard this statement from his teacher, Rabbi Yochanan, which is to say that these two verses would be used as a proof text later for, well, in other contexts, why you do not have music after the destruction of the temple, including the clapping of hands, until here we're brought back to where we, our homeland, and more, until the nations proclaim, greatly has Adonai done with these, meaning with the Israelites. And then verse 3, greatly Adonai does with us, we delight. And here again, this back and forth of tenses, which is the nature of the Hebrew, has also a dream-like quality, in which in a dream there's this mixing of time. And of course, with it, a psalm that can be read. This is a psalm that is today read on Israel's Independence Day. It says of Menachem Begin that when he went to sign the Camp David Accords with Anwar Sadat at the White House lawn, Menachem Begin read this psalm as part of the signing, meaning this psalm is seen as celebration of a dream fulfilled. And yet, the second half is a prayer of pointing to a quality of incompleteness. Shuva Adonai et shivitenu, the same words used in the opening verse, shuv and shivat, but here, if you will, as a plea. Restore Adonai our fortune like wadis in the Negev. So there's incompleteness. And some scholars would say that's, or classic commentators, that's because although this is written with the return and celebration, it still was incomplete. The Jews came back from Babylonia. There was still uncertainty, so much to rebuild, so many who had not yet returned. And it was written in the context of that incompleteness. Others will say that, again, this is a dream that we're describing of returning. And now it's like you're waking up from the dream and you're saying, God, make it happen in the future. Restore fortune. And this image of the wadis of the Negev, Ka'afikim ba-Negev. So many translate, Negev as the south or as the desert. And the afikim, the wadis, are often translated as the mighty waters, the torrents. But wadis, afikim, is something distinctive to the south of Israel, of desert. We have it here in California too. Dry riverbeds that in the rainy season elsewhere can all of a sudden spring to life. And so the image here, this metaphor, How it works, first, literally in Israel, is the rains in the north will feed aquifers that will then flow in the winter, particularly to the south, watering. And the nature of those flows is that they come from an unseen distance. The rain is not happening, it's rather the runoff that's flowing underground. And that what flows is all of a sudden a dry riverbed is filled with water, and often fast flowing water. It can even at times be a flash flood. But how this is understood metaphorically differs among commentators. Some understand, like Rashi, that like the dry riverbed that now flows with water, so will be Israel. Although in exile we are dried up, we will fulfill what we were intended to be, a river, a flowing people. Others seeing it as an image of the return itself, that although hardly anybody came back, all of a sudden the wadi is filled with water, as if there are people flowing in return, just like the Negev flows with water, suddenly, unexpectedly, powerfully. And this last image continues with water, but now it's the water of a tear. They who sowed with a tear. And why are they crying? They're crying, again, many possibilities with this metaphor. They're crying because of the uncertainty. Will the crops grow? They are crying because it is hard work to plant. Samson Raphael Hirsch, the important rabbi of Frankfurt, Germany of the 19th century, will see this as a description of exile, and what is getting planted are the teachings of Israel among their neighbors, feeling rejected in those teachings. But there will become a time that, like a dream, where you're out of touch with reality, Samson Raphael Hirsch will say, we will awake to see our impact of what we have sowed upon the nations among whom we were exiled. With joyous songs shall reap, and 6 is linked to 5. Haloch Yelech can also be translated, he will surely go, and weeps, carrying a Meshech Hazara. The word Meshech literally means to pull, limshoch. I chose, some translated as a bag of seeds. Richard Levy translates it as a trail of seeds, as if it's seeds that have been thrown. I chose basket of seed, as a basket is woven by pulling. He comes, he shall come with joyous song, carrying his sheaves. And so the image is of restoration, that although one yearned, the yearning, the dreaming of return will be actualized. And now a closing thought to pull this together, of relating to content, and then a comment about the structure. And that is, it is such a psalm, Psalm 126, that was sung at every festive meal before grace after meals, that reinforced the longing of return. And in the grace after meals, every time one finished a meal, traditionally in which one ate bread, one, as part of that prayer, said, "Praised are you, O God, who will rebuild Jerusalem." And so 126 was linked to grace after meals on festivals as the taste of return. The tradition was that Psalm 137 was said before grace after meals on a weekday. 137 is the psalm that describes, by the rivers of Babylon we wept. The psalm that said, on the weekday we live in a world of exile, from the dream fulfilled of closeness to God, of safety, of the world acknowledging our special relationship with God. So on weekdays, the counterpoint to Psalm 126 was 137. But on Shabbat, and not just on Shabbat and holidays, but also at a wedding or at the celebration of the bringing a child into covenant with Brit Milah, Psalm 126 was chanted, was sung. There are many melodies, but it is a psalm that was sung, as many of the psalms, but this one in particular. There are melodies of celebration that accompany it, because the future for 2,000 years of exile was experienced with this reading as if it was fulfilled. It was as if you could taste the return, as if you were carrying the sheaves of the soil of Israel and agriculture restored, and that it was Psalm 126 that gave hope across time, that indeed enabled a miracle of a people returning after close to 2,000 years of exile, to reclaim the language, to reclaim the dignity of self-determination. Psalm 126 structurally, like many of these psalms of return, is composed of reoccurring words. So in the very beginning, Shuv is related to Shivat. Hayinu is in verses 1 and 3. Az twice in verse 2. Verses 1 to 3 have these reoccurring words. Higdil in verses 2 and 3. And that quality of repetition creates a rhythm of ascent, of movement. And likewise, verses 4 to 6 as a unit repeat, but different words. The words of Shuva with Shivitenu in verse 4. Hazorim with Alumotav, at least in terms of the image. Verse 6, Haloch and Yelech, the same words. Bo Yavo. And again, the opening and closing theme of Rina, of joyous song. And so in composition, the psalm, in sum, is artful in its ambiguity in structure. It's artful in its repetition of words to create the sense of stepping forward, of ascending, and at the same time, like a dream, leave the reader choosing and needing to interpret the word's meaning. With that, I'm going to start with my friend Rabbi Glick as our first commentator. In that, Rabbi Glick, a word about Rabbi Glick. Rabbi Glick's a rabbi in Chicago, was an intern at CBI, used to be a journalist writing for the Jerusalem Post when I first met Adir in Jerusalem, and was born. Adir was born in Jerusalem, though spent many years with his family in France, has lived in many places in the world. And Adir, you're a Yerushalmi, if I'm right. Is that right? You're born in Jerusalem?
I am. I was born in Jerusalem and grew up in the old city, and it's my favorite city in the world to this day.
And tell us about how hearing Psalm 126 resonates for you.
So it's very interesting. I've always seen it kind of where you finished as an expression of the realization of dreams of maybe the soul of our Zionism, and not just the modern manifestation of Zionism, but that part of Jewish tradition and people that's been yearning for our homeland for thousands of years. And as you said, we recite this at the beginning of Birkat Hamazon. And so when I read this, it connects to that place of connection to the land of Israel, to Jerusalem, to the people of Israel. But so I was actually inspired by you some months ago to teach Psalms in my congregation as well. And it was really interesting. This time when we studied this Psalm together, something that came to us was that it's not only, sometimes I will talk about the Psalms as the songs of the soul of Israel, that the Psalms are the expression of the soulfulness of the Jewish people. But that this one is not only the soul of Zionism, but says something even more deeply about being Jewish, about the movements, the quality of wandering in the world as a Jew. And as you were closing, I was thinking when you were mentioning the Haloch Yelech and the parallelism between the shuv at the beginning and the shuv in the second half, that movement, there's a sense of movement in the psalm. You begin beshuv, and then there's az yamale. So the movement of the psalm from tears to joy is our movement as a Jewish people. This is who we are. We go between those poles. And that Talmud piece that you mentioned, which I also love, right? So it says, "Az yemales chokpinu," our mouths shall be filled with laughter. But in some sense, part of our Jewish condition is that for much of our history, we've not been that people filled with laughter. We laugh, we're joyous, we have more words for joy than almost any other emotion. But as someone once put it to me, we're not a belly laughter kind of people, because there's always that side of us. It's a little bit sad because we look at the world, and as you said, we break the glass at the wedding, that story in the Talmud. So at the end of that story, right, when he breaks a 400 zuz glass, oy vavoy, and he said, "Why did you do that? How could you have done? How could you have broken the glass?" And he says, "Kavod rosh," right, because of sobriety, because we need to have a heavy head. And so I don't think that means that we're not a joyous people, but that even in the most joyful moments, we hold on to that truth that the world is broken, not only to remain sober, but maybe also because then it prompts us to create partnerships to make the world whole. And that's what a marriage is, right? We're in partnership with another person to try and bring the world back to shleimut, back to wholeness. So when I read this psalm, I see in it the very purpose of the Jewish people of Az Yamale. Our mouths may not be completely filled with laughter now, but one day we will. We believe in that truth. We have hope in that truth. And our tongues will be filled with songs of joy. And until that day, we will work tirelessly with all of our relationships in those communities to bring that to fulfillment.
Lovely, lovely series of ways in which this psalm touches you. Is there anybody else in response to Rabbi Glick or to my sharing the variety of commentaries that you would like to add something? Alex, go ahead.
Couple of things. The first is to emphasize that in this song, we need to partner with God to get the results. We need to go out and sow with tears in order that we shall be able to reap. So we still have to be in partnership with God. We have our role to play in the restoration. Second is just a little bit of, I don't know, resentment that nations of the world don't say greatly has Adonai done with these. The nations of the world say greatly has international capital and imperialism and the Jewish conspiracy has done with this. And what they don't they just refuse to give credit to God, our restoration in Israel. Anyway, that's all.
So, two things to echo in terms of what you've shared, Alex. One is, I love the sense of you pointing toward the sowing as partnership, that the crops won't come wildly, they won't come without the effort, that it's about partnership of effort that will enable this sense of harvest. And that will grow as a motif in Judaism, particularly in the Jewish mystical tradition of 16th century forward, with the idea of repairing the world. That idea of gathering sparks, of partnering with God, really will only blossom in the 6th century and forward. But it's here, it's also embedded, that sense of not passivity, but partnership. And the last piece, as you were focusing on, greatly has Adonai done with these, two aspects. One is the way that the psalm is composed. It's rejoicing, verses 1 and 3. And in the middle, because it's rejoicing, rejoicing, and in the middle is focusing on this repetition of this phrase, greatly has Adonai done with these, or greatly has Adonai done with us. And for me, attention still is that it's only after others acknowledge that Adonai has done greatly for us do we say it about ourselves. And I don't, again, that leaves me with a little tension of the need also embedded here of having others affirm God's goodness. And until that happens, as you suggest, Alex, we live in a time in which it's not seen necessarily by others, Israel achievement as being a gift of God, but can be viewed negatively or in a way that undermines it as pointing to God. One other reaction or something that got Irene, go ahead.
Thank you very much. This is for Rabbi Adir especially, and Cantor Shula. When the first Shavuot, after the retaking of the city of Jerusalem, they sang this psalm, and it's in the autobiography of Rabbi Aryeh Levine, who is a great Chassid and friend of the Nazir, that he realized for the first time what a dream was. I'm not going to go into detail because you're the expert on dreams and sleep, but it's a really beautiful passage in the biography of the chief rabbi of Haifa, who I keep coming back to, Shai Yishuv Cohen, who was deputy mayor of Jerusalem at the time in 1967. He was under 40, as well as all the other things he did. He was deputy mayor, and he bumped into this old man who was very famous, who used to go to the prisons under the British mandate. And he said, I now know what this means. We have been in a dream for all these years, and we have come back. And then he went into the psychological thing of what a dream is, which I won't. But as you've got so many people here who are from Yerushalayim originally, I just thought I'd say that.
Well, thank you, Irene. And so Shula has her hand up, and I'll recognize you, but I'll just give context. As Irene knows, as a regular in our class, not only is Adir a Yerushalmi born in Jerusalem, but so is Cantor Shula. Go ahead, Shula.
For me, the most important phrase is Hayinu kecholmim, always was, because as you know from my prior comments different times, somehow visuals come to mind. And when I saw Hayinu kecholmim, I right away saw the people who have yearned for coming back to Israel. And then when they did, they fell down to the ground and kissed the earth. Mm-hmm. And kecholmim, somehow I see that, because the rest of the psalm describes that we are maybe those who are zorim bedim'ah, we are those who are haloch yelech uvacho, we are the ones with the tears and with the weeping. But the joy of Lashuv, of Shiva, is like the dream come true. We are like the dreamers whose dream has indeed been able to come true if you only let us do that. And I see the kissing of that earth when that happens with the word cholmim.
Thank you. Dreaming and celebrating what was a dream now actualized. So let me close with one image that relates to a deer. Adir, you want to add something? And I have an image that relates to you.
Oh, well, I'll look forward to hearing it. I was just going to add to the comment before that I once met Shai Yashuv Cohen, the son of the Nazir, and spent a few days with him, and a very special man, and he really carried some of that spirit of the earlier Rav Kook, I think, and the spirit of the joy of returning to the land from the religious place, but maybe not quite as intermingled with all the political as well, kind of the Kabbalistic and Hasidic soul of it. Yeah.
So here's an image that relates to you, Adir, to pull this together. And in regard to Irene's bringing Haifa to my mind, and that is, there is a Jewish Peace Corps out of Israel called Tevel B'Tzedek. It's agriculturally focused on enabling people, starting with the people of Nepal after the earthquake some 14 years or so ago, to be able to reclaim their livelihoods and to do so with best agricultural practices. It was created by a friend of Adir's and mine named Micha Odenheimer, who has had well over 1,000 volunteers come through from 1 month to several years. Adir was such a volunteer in Nepal with Tevel B'Tzedek, and it links to Irene in that it was just on today's Facebook that Micha Odenheimer posted a partnership with the University of Haifa for a master's in social action with Tevel B'Tzedek and Haifa University. And the goal was to take the resources of the modern state of Israel, particularly the resources of know-how and the energy of young people after the army in a gap year, and use those resources to enable others to plant, to water, and to sow. So much of the technology that they introduced is best agricultural practices. And so that's just a free association to honor Adir and Adir's brother, a product of Tevel B'Tzedek being kind of a co-leader who went on to become one of the key people in Israel Aid, the equivalent of Israel's aid to nations around the world with foreign aid, a key government-sponsored aid projects. And in the case of Adir's brother, much of that activism came out of the Tevel B'Tzedek experience in Nepal, which has since grown to doing work in Haiti and in Zambia now as well. And in that regard, there's another way to read Psalm 126. Once we have returned, we then have the tools to enable a flourishing of agriculture far and wide. So with that, another dimension, I'm honored, Adir, to have you, a teacher, a fellow teacher, a teacher of Psalms, in joining us. We always conclude with the Kaddish. So you want a last word, Adir, and then we'll say Kaddish.
Just to say thank you, and it's so nice to see familiar faces, and I had such a lovely few years at CBI. So just greetings to everyone, warm greetings to everyone. And again, when you suggested I'd be honored and you chose this psalm, it's probably my favorite psalm. So I jumped at it, as they say. So thank you.
You're most welcome.